Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that if the West grants Ukraine permission to use weapons like the Storm Shadow cruise missile, the French Scalp cruise missile, or the American ATACMS against targets in Russia, that would be a significant escalation. He said NATO countries would effectively be at war with Russia. Now, this is the latest in what has been 2.5 years of sort of saber-rattling threats from Vladimir Putin, who has continually threatened the prospect of nuclear war and global Armageddon as and when the West has dared to step up its support for Ukraine to resist his bloodbath invasion, which started more than 900 days ago on the 24th of February 2022. Now, we should see this in a number of contexts. Most recently, and I think perhaps really interestingly, is the opinions that we've heard from both Britain's MI6 spy chief Richard Moore and indeed Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, who both said when they were speaking in public in London just last week that Vladimir Putin, that Russia is the only side making these nuclear threats, these nuclear escalations. And their message was that actually the West must not be intimidated. Those were Bill Burns' opinion words. He said that it's both his opinion and that of his agency. The West must not be intimidated by Vladimir Putin's nuclear threat. Now, I mean, these threats cannot be ignored. Vladimir Putin has his finger on the world's largest nuclear arsenal. By some estimates, some 6,000 nuclear warheads exist in Russia. Around 1,500 of those are most likely deployed or deployable, the others in storage. But nonetheless, that is the world's biggest. Around 600 more warheads in Russia than in America, the world's two largest nuclear powers. And that is more than enough, far more than enough to burn the earth to a crisp. So we can't ignore Vladimir Putin's threats, but he has made these threats many, many times over the course of this war in Ukraine. And the message from Western officials who've been watching this very closely is that on most occasions, well, on every occasion so far, those threats have proved hollow. And indeed, these red lines that Russia and that Putin sets down, in fact, when tested, proved not to be red lines at all. Now, the closest the world has come to nuclear Armageddon since the start of the war in Ukraine, we understand, was most likely a weekend in October 2022. So about 8 months into the war in Ukraine, when Russian forces had been forced to retreat or abandon their attack on Kyiv. Their front lines had collapsed east of Kharkiv in northeastern Ukraine. And at that point as well, their forces were coming under spectacular pressure in Kherson in the south of Ukraine. They would soon abandon the city of Kherson, which was the only regional capital they captured during the course of the war. And at that point, there was real concern in America and indeed in the United Kingdom and many of the West NATO allies that Vladimir Putin was on the cusp of going nuclear. And that triggered an urgent flurry of diplomatic activity. So that shows us, that reminds us, these threats are backed by a very real possibility of disaster, because if Russia were to use these nuclear weapons, it would be a global catastrophe. And the fear in October 2022 was that Vladimir Putin might unleash what is known as a tactical nuclear weapon. These are weapons that have a smaller payload than larger doomsday strategic nuclear weapons that might be fired between or at cities, at capital cities like Moscow, London, Washington in the event of World War III. But nonetheless, tactical nuclear weapons would still be devastating if they were unleashed on the battlefield. And the fears that Russia was planning to use them unleashed an urgent flurry of diplomatic activity. We know because Bill Burns told us when he was in London last week that he was dispatched to Turkey. This is the director of the CIA, was sent to Turkey by US President Joe Biden to meet his Russian counterpart, Sergei Narishkin, the director of what is the successor to the KGB, Russia's foreign intelligence service, and he delivered a message. He said in very clear terms of what the consequences would be for Russia if indeed it went nuclear. Now, Bill Burns did not go into details about what those consequences would be. But we understand the message from America was that there would be a massive anti-conventional response from both the United States and Ukraine's allies against Russia. Particularly, they would get involved conventionally, not with nuclear weapons, but with conventional weapons in the conflict in Ukraine. And at the same time, they launched a diplomatic initiative to get at Russia's allies like China and India on board to try and rein in the Kremlin, to pull them back from the brink of a nuclear war. And that succeeded. Now, the feeling is perhaps that that same process is now set, that has set a protocol, and that process might work again if it were required to. The message from Bill Burns and indeed from Richard Moore, the head of Britain's MI6 intelligence service, foreign intelligence service, known as the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS, was that these threats from Russia are irresponsible and they should not and must not deter the West. All of this is relevant at the moment because it appears the West is inching closer, particularly America, is inching closer to finally giving Ukraine permission to use long-range Western weapons against targets on Russian soil. Now, Britain has been pretty bullish on this for weeks, if not months, saying that Ukraine absolutely has the right to defend itself, and that right to self-defense includes hitting back at Russia, hitting back at legitimate military targets. Particularly, we're talking about things like air bases and logistics hubs, which are supporting Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. We know that Ukraine wants to hit a dozen or so airfields in Russia, which are used on an almost nightly basis to launch these attacks, devastating airstrikes against Ukraine that are killing soldiers, killing civilians, and crippling the country's energy infrastructure. From Ukraine's point of view, it is absurd that Russia is using drones from Iran, missiles from North Korea, artillery shells from North Korea to hit Ukraine on a nightly basis, but Ukraine is not allowed to hit back at Russia with weapons that come from its Western allies. America appears to be inching closer to lifting that de facto ban, and that signaling from Washington, from US officials, is what has triggered this warning from Vladimir Putin, this warning that any change in the West position, were those weapons to be used against Russia, he said that would be a significant escalation, and effectively NATO countries would be at war with Russia. Now, we can interpret from that perhaps he is worried. It's unlikely that any one weapon, whether it's Storm Shadow, the French Scalp, or the American ATACMS, it's unlikely that any one weapon will change the balance of the war. We've heard from many generals saying there is no silver bullet to this, but I would argue that perhaps just as important, if not more important than the weapons themselves, is the show of Western resolve that Russia would see from a decision to allow these weapons to be. Now, President Zelensky said that Vladimir Putin only understands strength, and that echoed in many ways the comments from Britain's Lord George Robertson, a former NATO Secretary General and Defence Minister here in the UK, who's repeatedly met Vladimir Putin, who wrote in a briefing note earlier this summer that the West cannot be inhibited by fear of escalation in its support from Ukraine. He was really arguing that the West has to take the gloves off, has to show resolve, and has to show willingness to arm Ukraine to fight as hard as it can in order to deter Russia. And it's not just about deterring Russia. Ultimately, this is about convincing Russia to end its bloodbath war in Ukraine. Because 2.5 years in, we must remember Russia started this war. As Prime Minister Keir Starmer said on his visit to Washington, D.C., it is in Vladimir Putin's gift to end this war quickly. Zelensky's message is that Putin only understands strength. It remains to be seen whether or not Keir Starmer, whether or not Joe Biden will answer these threats from Russia by caving in to Moscow's saber-rattling, or whether they will show resolve